All she's done is disappoint me. Those words hit with the force of a hammer on fine furniture, so loud that everyone in the hall turned to look. Dad's voice traveled not because he was yelling, but because he knew how to project. Years of command training hadn't left him. He stood ramrod straight, chest puffed out, the kind of man who could silence a room without raising his voice. And right then, he used that power not to teach a lesson, not out of pride, but to make me feel small. To humiliate me. The reunion was supposed to be a low-key affair. Just family, neighbors, and old friends gathered in the town's community hall, the kind of place usually reserved for bingo nights and fish fries. Folding chairs groaned under the weight of aging veterans in neatly pressed khakis. Women were fanning themselves in the late summer heat, and kids zipped around with paper cups full of lemonade. It wasn't fancy, but it had the familiar smell of Homewood Polish fried chicken and the faint scent of brass polish still clinging to the veterans' medals. I had walked in holding my head high, not expecting a celebration, but at least basic decency. It had been years since I'd been in the same room as my father, years since he'd acknowledged I even existed beyond a quick, dismissive remark. Yet there we were, breathing the same air again. He saw me the second I walked in. His eyes narrowed, and his lips tightened into a thin line. If I didn't know him better, I might have thought he was about to give a speech. Instead, he waited for the chatter to die down on its own. Then he dropped those words like a grenade in the middle of the room. All she's done is disappoint me. The silence that followed was deafening, even more intense than applause. It roared in my ears and burned my cheeks. I kept my face neutral, but every muscle in my body screamed at me to move, to shout back, to do anything other than stand there like a kid being called to the principal's office. It could become armor if you repeat it enough. I never looked back. Once I was back at base, I added a new item to every pre-mission checklist. Who do you want us to call at home if things go wrong? We wrote down names and carried those phone numbers like they were lucky charms. Hill started leaving a cup of coffee on my desk every morning without saying a word. The team started knocking twice on the table before every briefing. We made it a point to ask each other, "How's your air?" And we meant, "How are you doing inside?" emotionally, not the air outside. An old chief called it being soft, but he stopped after it saved a young guy's life. I tried calling my father late one night, figuring the distance would make me braver. He answered on the second ring and just said, "Hello." I asked him about the gutters, the weather, and our neighbor's maple tree that had been leaning dangerously for years. "Came down," he said. "Took out the fence." I told him I was sorry to hear that. He said, "Check your tires before winter hits." And then we hung up, just like we had coordinated some kind of delivery. Promotions came around like the seasons, feeling inevitable, but still startling. A rumor about my nickname got out, even past the rooms where I ate. He never asked me about it. On his birthday, I mailed him a book of national parks because I remembered when I was 7 years old, he lifted me up to a carved wooden bear and said, "That's the real country." Inside the book, I wrote, "We could go see one together sometime." He sent a thank you card back, and his name was typed under the closing like he was signing official orders. There's a kind of fatigue that doesn't come from traveling miles and miles. It comes from going over the answers in your head to questions you know will never be asked. I learned to keep my phone face down, and the ringer turned off. I learned to hold onto a truth without needing anyone to salute it. The teams knocked when it mattered. "Yes," I said, defaulting to mercy. We took our old places at the kitchen table that had weathered our wars. He kept his hands wrapped around the mug, like it was field heat. I kept mine on the table, so he could see they were empty. "I didn't know," he said finally. For words that weigh more than an apology, if you're careful with them. "I didn't tell you." I countered, then added what mattered. "I couldn't, and you didn't ask." He considered that, and the fairness that had once made him a good junior officer reappeared around his eyes. "I didn't ask." He repeated it, not defensively, just stating a fact. I wanted him to breathe in, then exhale, the past. I had expected a son to carry a name that was foolish and unkind. I didn't rush in to offer forgiveness. We were both too old for quick fixes. "Names get heavy," I said. I picked up a different kind of weight. He nodded slowly. "They called you that." He trailed off, embarrassed by the sentimentality of it. A nickname is just a handle, I said. What matters is what you lift with it. He stared at a spot on the table where the varnish had bubbled years ago when I'd set a pot down while it was too hot. He'd lectured me for an hour about it. He reached out and touched the blemish like it was a map legend. Did you ever want me there? He asked. Only if you could stand, I said. Not for me, for yourself. We talked not about missions or medals, but about the atmosphere inside old men, about loss that first comes as silence, and then as furniture you keep bumping into at night. I told him Mom's last words to me, because they belong to both of us. Keep flying. Not away, just up. He looked away long enough that the clock over the sink ticked off 3 full minutes. When he turned back, his voice had changed pitch. If I came to something, he made a general gesture that meant anything with chairs facing forward. Would there be a seat? There's always a seat, I said. You choose where to put your hands. Then, as if that one blow wasn't enough, he turned. One of his big, weathered hands landed on the shoulder of a man standing nearby. The man was younger than my dad, older than me, with broad shoulders, a clean-cut haircut, and the kind of bearing you immediately recognized. This, Dad said proudly, his voice booming, this is a man who knows what service means. An elite member of the Navy SEALs. The hall murmured with impressed voices. Heads nodded, and eyes shot toward the stranger. Respect practically radiated from the crowd, directed away from me and toward the man Dad had chosen to praise. My father's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile, more like a smug look of satisfaction, as if he'd proven his point without saying it out loud. This is what I wanted, not her. I should have looked away, should have swallowed the insult, and let the moment pass. But I didn't. I couldn't. The SEAL turned, his eyes landing on me. For a split second, his expression held the same easy confidence he'd worn when Dad introduced him. Then it vanished. The color drained from his face. His mouth opened slightly, just enough for me to see the tremble in his jaw. He froze. And then, in a voice barely louder than a whisper, trembling but clear enough for everyone nearby to hear, he said, "Are you the Black Widow of the SEALs?" The words sliced through the hall like a knife. Murmurs spread through the room. A veteran in the back straightened up. A younger man swallowed hard, as if the title itself carried weight. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The name hung there, heavy and undeniable. For a heartbeat, even my father faltered. His smug look disappeared, replaced by confusion flickering behind his eyes. He didn't know what the SEALs knew. He didn't understand the stories whispered in the barracks, in the briefing rooms, on the tarmacs before missions. My father's door only swung open because of the weather. A mutual friend from their church finally broke the ice between us. She wrote in a loopy cursive, "He keeps your picture in his study. He doesn't talk about it." I read that sentence over and over until it didn't sting as much. Care can look a lot like custody. When the Navy gave me a medal for something that really took a dozen people to pull off, I sent him the program in block letters, just the way he liked addresses. No response. A month later, I got a different envelope. "They're making you a symbol," he had written in his small, precise handwriting. Those 5 words felt like a door slamming shut. Labels are neat and tidy until you have to live under them. A symbol doesn't sit with a grieving chief at 3 a.m. A symbol doesn't memorize families. I kept showing up with a sharpened pencil and an open map, listening for the hum in the lines. I stopped needing him to hear it too. I wrote one last time before that night in the hall. "I'm coming through town for a reunion," I said. "There's a seat if you want it." He didn't reply. The invitation felt like leaving a glass of water next to a sleeping person and then walking out. You don't expect to find it empty or full when you come back. You just didn't want them to wake up thirsty. Silence taught me a paradox that the teams had only hinted at. You can love someone without letting them steer your life. You can respect the parts of you they helped build without living under their roof. I stopped knocking on a door that only opened to let in drafts. I set the latch on my side. I waited for the work to come. It never makes you wait long. The first time I realized the teams were my family, we were ankle-deep in gray water under a sky the color of scraped metal. A storm had come in with a crooked wind that pushed the channel sideways, and the radios were gurgling with salt water. His gaze moved to the doorway and stayed there. I realized he was picturing himself walking through it, not as a commander, but as someone seeking forgiveness. The muscles for that motion had weakened from disuse. He would have to build them up like any rookie. I didn't wait for him to say something bolder. The plan was simple. Leave without making a scene, return without any expectations. I stood, rinsed my mug, set it upside down to dry. At the doorway, he cleared his throat. Proud, he said, one word, exposed. Then he added, quieter, as if he didn't want to startle the truth, even when I didn't know how. I didn't cry. I nodded. Do the knowing now, I said, and stepped into the brightness. Back on base, I answered emails that had gathered while the night did its rearranging. A chaplain wrote to say the town was speaking with a kinder voice today. A mother I'd met once at a pinning ceremony wrote, my boy said you make rooms feel taller. Thank you for letting him be tall. I typed back. He stood himself. I just moved the chairs. Command called, curious in the way bureaucracies get when reputation and statistics intersect. Would I brief a new working group on training reforms and the human factors we pretend are optional? I said yes because men I loved were breathing in rooms that might someday be safer if I kept telling the truth. Respect, I reminded them, is a logistics problem. Plan for it and watch what doesn't break. Letters followed the briefing. Some written in block capitals, some in the shaky script of men who had outlived their squad. A young officer asked if I had advice for leading when a room resents your pronouns. I told her, show your math and share your credit. Knock twice before you enter any soul. She wrote back that she'd printed it and taped it inside her locker next to a picture of her mother holding a wrench. Weeks later, an envelope arrived with my father's precise handwriting on it. He had spent years calling me a disappointment, blind to the reputation I had built, the life I had carved out with blood and grit far from his sight. That was the moment the room started to tilt. Not in my favor, not yet, but away from him, away from his authority, his certainty. But before I take you deeper into that scene, before I tell you why a man trained in the toughest parts of the military would tremble at the sight of me, I need to take you back. Because the truth is that moment didn't begin in that hall. It started years before, in a house where discipline was valued more than love, where silence was louder than praise, where every path I chose seemed like a betrayal in his eyes. I was raised in the shadow of a man who wore his medals like armor and who believed his legacy would only live on through a son. But he didn't have one. He had me. And in his mind, that was his first disappointment. The rest, at least according to him, was inevitable. The first lesson my father taught me wasn't how to throw a ball. It was how to stand at attention. He planted my heels together on the kitchen linoleum, pushed my shoulders back, and told me not to blink. A straight back tells the world you won't break, he said. I was 8 years old. The clock above the stove ticked. The house smelled like black coffee and shoe polish. That was our family's signature scent. He was retired by then, but retirement hadn't softened him. It just gave him more hours to perfect his control. Morning runs at 0530, shirts ironed to razor sharpness. Yes, sir, and no, sir, spoken like breathing. Our small town adored him. He gave speeches at the high school parades. He had a folding chair with his name on it at the Veterans Hall. People called him sir at the grocery store. I called him Dad and felt like I was borrowing a title I hadn't earned. He believed legacies pass through sons. My mother believed in other kinds of inheritances, quiet books and mercy. We were getting ready to launch a small package for a recovery operation that would never make the news. Nothing cinematic, no hero shots, no swelling music, just men checking straps with fingers that knew how to count heartbreak, and me at a folding table with a grease pencil and a plan I could run in my sleep. Widow Hill said he never called me ma'am when it was just us. You want a second set of eyes? I said, I want your doubt, and slid the board over to him. If it holds up to that, it holds. He looked it over, grunted, and then tapped a box I had drawn in the corner. You put the soft fail here. Always put the soft fail where you can see it, I said. Saves you from the hard one. He nodded, satisfied, the way older brothers do when the younger one finally lifts something he couldn't lift last summer. We moved. The operation bent once, and then it behaved. Not because luck suddenly became generous, but because we had rehearsed the folds. Back at the pier, soaked and quiet, a young seal I had been watching, a good kid who had a habit of aiming his jaw at the floor, stopped beside my table. "You knew the second pump was dying," he said. "I knew it." Could I asked, knowing was the only kind that keeps people safe? He thought about that and then said almost shyly, "Thanks for making a plan I could fit inside." It was the best compliment I had ever been given. Men who trusted maps more than speeches had decided mine could carry them. That's how a family gets built in our world, one night of proof at a time. Between rotations, I kept rewriting the training modules, the way you update your will. Not because you're eager to use it, but because you love what it protects. We added stress inoculation, and it wasn't about breaking bodies. It was about teaching a mind to recognize its own weather. I wrote a checklist called After the After. What to do not just in the hour after contact, but in the week after the adrenaline leaves and the silence arrives. Inside, a clipping from a local paper, no photo, just a paragraph about the reunion and a line that said, "The community stood to honor service." Beneath it, he had written, "I should have stood sooner." 5 words, oddly familiar. I pinned them beside a map of a county that didn't need mapping and let them make the room a little different. Remy visited once on his way through to a school he didn't think he deserved to teach at. He brought his mother's pecan pie and a modest discomfort with my office. "Too tidy," he said, smiling. "You'd hate my garage. We sat on crates because chairs lie to you about power." He asked if he'd done right in the hall. "You told the truth," I said. Truth stands up fine without a witness, but some nights it appreciates the company. When he left, he knocked twice on my door jamb like a man borrowing luck he meant to return. The night before I headed back east, I stopped at Mom's grave. The grass had grown back even where our grief had scuffed it. I pressed my palm to the stone because some words require skin to travel. "We're learning," I said aloud to the quiet air. Slow but in the right direction. The wind moved through the oaks with the patience of old women quilting. I took it as an answer. In the end, revenge didn't feel like a big show. It felt like stillness, like choosing not to twist the knife when history hands it to you, like standing so straight other people remember their own spines and find them sufficient. The room had stood. My father hadn't then, couldn't then, maybe would. That was enough of a beginning for one life. People ask what the nickname means. I tell them it's just a handle. What matters is what you lift with it. Teams, truth, the corner of a room that won't get light unless someone pulls the curtain. If you were in that hall, you would remember the sound that oak floor made when respect put its weight down. I remember. And when the nights get long, I let that sound play again. It's better than applause. At home, she tucked poems into my lunch bag. Frost, Hughes, Dickinson, like good luck charms. She never argued with my father. She waited out the storms. Some storms only answer to time, she'd say. When I was 12, he took me to an Army-Navy game. The stadium was filled with steam and brass bands. Cadets in long coats marched like chess pieces. When Navy scored, I cheered. He didn't even look at me. "Leave those colors to men who can pull their weight," he said. Eyes on the field. I pretended I hadn't heard him. Pretending became a habit. At home, there was the altar. A glass case filled with medals spaced just so, dusted every Saturday with a brush from a velvet pouch. My job was the uniforms. He taught me the iron's weight, the angle of the press, the snap, when a crease was perfect. "Precision is respect," he'd say. I learned the regulations like other kids learned pop songs. I could identify every ribbon by color before I could do long division. When I was 15, I told him I wanted to apply to the Naval Academy. He went so still I could hear the refrigerator humming. "You want attention?" he said, not looking up from the mail. "Not service." I told him I wanted both. He set the letters down one by one, like bricks between us. "You don't have the Constitution." He wasn't talking about my stamina. He meant my gender. The house got quiet after that. Silence was his weapon. Dinner at 6 p.m., dishes stacked to the left of the sink. News at 7 p.m., lights out at 10 p.m. When I aced chemistry, he said, When I want to track meat, he said, don't get sloppy with your form. Saturday mornings, he inspected my room. The bed had to be drum tight. The shoes had to sit at a perfect 45-degree angle. Once, he found a dust speck on the windowsill and handed me the cloth. My mother did her persuading in the margins. She drove me to the recruiter's office the first time, parking 2 blocks away so the car wouldn't be seen from Main Street. We piloted it with 3 platoons. Near misses dropped. Bad surprises got smaller. The old guard teased us, and then they started using the forms when no one was watching. Widow's Church, Torres called it, half joking and half grateful. Everybody gets out with their shoes. We made rituals that looked small. Knock twice on the table before wheels up. Ask, how's your air? In the chow line and wait for the answer. Make the new guys brief the boring parts so they learn that boredom keeps you alive. When a chief's marriage fell apart, we found him a counselor who knew how to sit with men who traded sleep for safety. When a kid's mother got sick, the platoon pretended it was a logistics problem and arranged the flights. One afternoon in the cage, I watched a group of candidates work a knot. They pretended it wasn't choking them. Sweat turned their shirts into maps. An instructor barked. I stepped in only to ask a question. What's your plan when the plan is wrong? At first, they just stared blankly, and then one spoke up. We look for the pattern under the pattern. I smiled. That's a life skill, not just a job skill. Keep it. Reputation is a slow river. You only notice it when it's carved the bank. Directors from the other side of the house, intel, logistics, even a doc with hands steady enough to stitch a hummingbird, started drifting by my little room with questions. I printed fewer glossy slides and more checklists. I learned to translate between the men who built the doors and the men who kicked them in. The nickname, which I still never use for myself, traveled around like a postcard with no return address. A visiting captain introduced me at a briefing as the one who hears the web hum. I resisted the urge to roll my eyes. It wasn't humming I heard. It was men. Their pauses, their jokes that were too loud, the way their hands fumbled with a strap when their thoughts were at home in rooms they feared. It's the sound of a community editing itself toward courage. Blood didn't salute that night. Honor did, and it still does if we let it. If this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of someone who stood for you when others didn't, or of a room that changed because a truth finally spoke, take a breath with me. Share your moment below so someone else can borrow your courage. And if you want more stories that carry weight without shouting about service, mercy, and standing tall, stick around, subscribe, and bring a friend who needs the reminder. We rise straighter when we rise together. While I filled out the forms, she graded papers in the front seat. When I came back with pamphlets, she didn't ask what he'd say. She asked what I wanted most. A fair fight, I said. She tapped the steering wheel, then prepared me for unfair weather. Senior year, I mailed the application without telling him. I wrote my essay at the kitchen table after midnight, when the house was a silent museum of breathing. I described the cadence at dawn, how order could create space inside someone told she was too much. When the thin envelope came first, we acknowledged its arrival. I hid it in a book. When the thick one arrived in March, I pressed it to my chest until the cold seeped through the paper. I waited until he was in his study. I knocked and stepped inside. He looked up, his jaw set. I held out the envelope. Sir, I said. He slid it open with a letter opener and read the first line. We are pleased to offer. He stopped. He folded the paper and slid it back. So, you're serious about this? He said, not as a question. I nodded. He turned back to his ledger. We'll discuss it later. We didn't. Graduation night. He didn't come to the backyard party my mother had decorated with white lights and lemonade. Friends asked if I was scared. Yes and no, I said. Yes, about the water. No, about the choice. Around 9 p.m., a familiar sedan rolled past and kept going. It felt like being saluted and dismissed at once. The morning I left for plebe summer, my mother tucked 3 envelopes into my duffel bag. Open one. She wrote, "When you're lonely, when you're hurt, when you forget who you are." She hugged me hard at the bus station, then stepped back to inspect me like before school. "Stand up straight," she said, and we both laughed. My father had an appointment to get his tires rotated. On the bus, a boy with a buzz cut asked if I was nervous. "Nerves are a compass," I said. "You just have to read them right. You learn to listen to what a body says when the mouth is busy elsewhere." One winter, the ocean turned mean and took a diver who didn't deserve it. We stood in dress blues on a cold parade deck while the wind stabbed at us, and a bell tolled an account too small for the size of the loss. Afterward, a kid about the age I would have been if the world were kinder stood in front of me and tried to ask how to bear it. "You don't," I said softly. "You carry it. There's a difference." He nodded, his eyes bright, like a man filing away a truth he didn't want, but would need. Loyalty came back in currencies that lasted longer than medals. Hill named his second daughter Avery because he said the name could run. Torres, who had once sneered at my mental health check-ins, now ran them with a voice you could sit on. At Christmas, my desk filled up with cards from people who didn't usually write cards. "Ma'am," one scribbled, "your web kept me breathing this year." On leave again, I visited a base where the chapel had more scuff marks on its pews than the gym had on its floor. A chaplain I trusted said, "You know you're ministering." I laughed. "I'm managing risk." He tilted his head. "Same job, different incense." I tried dating a few civilians, nice men who wanted me safe. They talked about weekends like they were a promise. I talked about Tuesday night flights like they were the weather. Most of them looked at my hands and saw steel, where I wanted them to see steadiness. It turned out the only people who didn't ask me to be smaller were the ones who understood why space is something you make, not take. Love would find me later, and it wouldn't ask me to lie about the weight. The kid with the jaw tilt, his name was Remy, turned into a man in front of me, the way the sun turns frost into a road. He'd be the one years later to see me in a crowded hall and lose his voice, his memory and gratitude colliding behind his eyes. Out the window, the town slid by. The hardware store, the diner with the lemon pies, the courthouse flag a little too big for the pole. As the miles ticked by and the air grew salty, I pressed my forehead to the glass and let the cold calm my cheeks. I wasn't running from him. I was running toward the only argument that made sense, earning it. Processing smelled like cut grass and chlorine, then salt and gun oil. Hair clippers buzzed. Clipboards appeared and vanished. Last name, height, move. That night, I lay on a narrow rack and recited the general orders so I wouldn't count the miles home. I thought about the kitchen linoleum and my father's palms setting my shoulders. He had taught me to stand up straight. He just never imagined I'd do it while facing him. By taps, I had memorized the number stenciled on the bunk above me. I whispered it like a prayer and closed my eyes. I didn't know yet what the teams would demand, what names they'd try to give me, or which ones I'd keep. I only knew this silence had done enough talking. It was my turn. Annapolis didn't love you back. It tested you. The plebe year shaved you down to what would hold under pressure. I learned quickly that the trick wasn't to be louder, it was to be exact. On the yard before sunrise, my breath making small fogs in the Chesapeake air, I ran until my chest burned and my legs moved like metronomes. I learned to fold exhaustion into a pocket and keep going. The academy gave me what my father never meant to, a way to measure myself without him. I commissioned into the Navy with a face that still looked too young for the uniform I wore, and orders that would park me close to the edges where maps blur. The first time I set foot at Coronado, I felt the Pacific wind hit me hard enough to make me stumble. Sand was everywhere, on my boots, in my teeth, under my tongue. Men lumbered past with logs on their shoulders. Teams moved as one organism on the grinder, slick with seawater and sweat. But before he could know that, he had to learn a different lesson. How to step into a room and make everyone else taller. We practiced. I made him brief, then fail, then fix it. You're not a gun with legs, I told him. You're a human with a brain that gets you home. On a hot spring afternoon that smelled like wet canvas and CLP, Command invited me to talk about best practices. I brought one slide. Respect is a logistics problem. It got a laugh and then a hush. I told them that when you plan for dignity, you prevent a dozen kinds of ruin. Write it down, I said. Then hold on to it when the weather turns. Word spread beyond our circle. A colonel I didn't know sent me a note. I hear you make rooms safer. I pinned it on the wall with a strip of blue tape and forgot to be humble for a minute. Then the day demanded humility again, and I gave it. Back home, my father's silence kept its posture. He never asked, never answered anything that wasn't yes or no. The town kept his coffee hot. Men in ball caps still thanked him for his service at the post office. And he nodded like a man receiving mail he didn't remember ordering. It wasn't anger I felt anymore. It was distance, with a shape I could measure and walk around. If the teams were my family, it was because we had chosen to be accountable to each other's lives. Blood can be an accident. Duty is not. The men knocked twice, and I knocked back, and we built a house out of habits that no storm could rip clean. That house would matter on the night when a community hall filled with people who knew my father's voice better than my own would all turn at once at a name spoken like a prayer and a warning. Family isn't who can hurt you the most. It's who refuses to. The hall breathed like a single lung after the question landed. Are you the Black Widow of the SEALs? Remy said it barely above a whisper, but rooms like that carry what they want. Conversations thinned into threads and then snapped. I wasn't there to become a SEAL. That path wasn't open to me. And I wasn't interested in arguing with a door that wouldn't open. I was there because a task unit needed an operations and intel officer who could think fast, write clearly, and carry weight without showing it. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room when you're the one quietly deciding which room everyone will kick down. They called me ma'am. At first, like a question. I learned to answer with schedules, comms, plans, and logistics that landed on time, and briefs so tight even the chief with a permanent scowl stopped tapping his pen. I ran with them when I could, swam in cold water because respect likes to see you shiver and stay anyway, and shot until the trigger press felt like thought. I didn't try to be one of them. I learned to be the one they couldn't afford to ignore. On a training range outside an island, the desert heat bleached the color out of everything. We ran shoot house drills under a relentless sun. Again and again, the instructors barked orders, and the teams moved with the efficiency of men who had bled for the right to make it second nature. I watched angles, watched where eyes went when stress rose, and wrote notes in a field book stiff with salt. In the evenings, I'd sit on a tailgate with a map across my knees while the wind tried to snatch it away. A chief named Hill leaned over once, squinting at the overlapping arcs I'd drawn around a target site. You like webs, he said. Webs catch what runs. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The first time we went forward, the air smelled like diesel and dust. Night lived in the corners, even at noon. We worked out of a borrowed room with a flickering strip light and a table that leaned to one side. Radios crackled like old men clearing their throats. I learned the music of the static, the call signs, the tightrope cadence of voices miles from each other, learning to move as if they shared a spine. Somewhere, a fork ticked against a plate, and then went still. The ceiling fans kept their slow rotation, as if the air hadn't changed its mind. My father's hand was still on Remy's shoulder, his fingers spread with the familiarity of men who understood rank and muscle. He looked from the young man to me, and back again, comprehension hunting for a foothold. The proud set of his jaw faltered, just a tremor, a hairline crack. Anyone else would have called it the light. Remy swallowed. I saw the tell, 2 beats high in his throat. He straightened his shoulders, squaring up to something he hadn't expected to salute tonight. Ma'am, he said, his voice steadier, louder, so there'd be no mistaking it now. Permission to breathe. Then talk, I said softly. He took a breath, like a man surfacing. You built the plan at Alcar. He said you spun the net when the roots went bad. We. He stopped, recalibrated. We got home because you heard it before we did. A murmur rolled through the room. The old VFW men in khakis shifted, rearranging their expressions. The women who had been fanning themselves lowered their paper programs. A boy of 12 looked at me like I'd stepped out of a story he wanted to believe. My father released Remy's shoulder, as if it had grown hot. "What is this?" he asked, aiming the question at the room so he wouldn't have to aim it at me. He chuckled once, for show. "Some nickname my daughter. Files papers. She doesn't." "Sir," Remy said, "respect is earned, not stolen. With all due respect, she doesn't file." He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't need to. The men who have walked back into fluorescent light carrying pieces they didn't count on know how to leave blanks intact. I moved then, not much. Half a step that put me where I could see the doors and the old flag by the stage and the reflection of us all in the glass of the trophy case. "It's just a name," I said. "Names are lighter than work." My job was to build the skeleton, the roots, timing, and contingencies that accounted for the human ways plans go sideways. There was a bomb maker burning through lives in a city that forgot its river until it choked on it. We mapped his habits. Where he ate, who lit his cigarettes, which door he used when he needed to disappear. We waited until a Tuesday because the Tuesday vendor took longer to count change. The team kid up in the dark, fingers quick on buckles, whispering. I stood with the radio and the feed, and the plan spread like an altar on the table. When the first truck stalled 2 blocks earlier than rehearsed, we didn't freeze. We shifted to Route C, called Church because it passed 3, and slid the timing forward 5 minutes. It should have fallen apart. It didn't. He came out the back as predicted, turned left as predicted, reached for the phone he always used, and found its tower sleeping. He hesitated for half a breath. That was enough. No shots, no fire. Hands behind his head, then zip ties, then the quiet after. Back at the room, the air stank of adrenaline and old coffee. Hill peeled off his gloves and looked at the web I'd drawn. "You spun that," he said, and he never saw the silk. The younger guys laughed at the line. Someone drew a spider in the corner of the map with a Sharpie, with crude legs and a red hourglass that bled through. The joke stuck. The name did, too. Black Widow wasn't about body count. It was about what you set and what you sensed. How the air changes when the wrong door opens. How a voice on a net goes up half a tone when a plan bumps a wall. After a while, guys who'd never smile in photos started knocking their knuckles twice on my table before stepping out. Superstition, respect, or both. Not every night went smoothly. Once on the coast, where the water wears a different name but has the same taste of salt, the plan tore itself apart. A truck blew, a tire on gravel weed scouted twice. A veteran near the coffee urn cleared his throat. "Which teams?" he asked, even though the answer didn't matter. "Habit." "Enough, Remy," I said, my eyes still on him, long enough to teach them to listen for the hum. The hum. The word carried. A man in the back who had stood taller when my father spoke now leaned forward, elbows on his knees. A younger woman, her hair in a bun, her jaw set the way people wear it when they've had to be their own witness, nodded once, like the room had finally introduced me properly. Dad tried for humor. "Well," he said, palms out, "I'm sure she's very good at her spreadsheets." It was the kind of line that wins small laughter in rooms that owe you deference. None came. Not this time. A cousin I barely knew, but who had my mother's eyebrows, spoke up, tentative but clear. "Uncle Frank, I think. I think maybe you don't know everything she is." Silence can wound. It can heal, too. The pause that followed wasn't empty. It was full of people recalculating, moving chairs in their heads. People are quick studies when the math is respect. Remy found his voice again. "Ma'am," he said, "I owe you, and I've never said it out loud. We were stacked wrong one night and you—" His eyes glistened hard, then cleared. "You fixed the angle. I still send my mother a card in May because you did. I didn't want this to turn into a testimony. The work doesn't belong to one throat. Team effort," I said, always. He shook his head, just enough to disagree without insubordination. "Teams don't cohere by accident." At a side table, the MC, Mrs. Dwyer, the elementary school receptionist who had once bandaged 1,000 playground knees, lifted the microphone slowly and then set it down. She understood when to let a room find its own gravity. Dad crossed his arms in that old fortress pose. "I know the difference between a story and a life," he said. And for a second, I saw him younger, his boots muddied in a river he didn't want to cross, still insisting. A light failed on a helmet at the worst corner. A dog we hadn't accounted for found his courage at the wrong second. I heard the shift in a breath. Hold 2, I said. 3 window instead of door. 4. Your pivot now. It sounded calm, because it needed to, not because I was. Later, alone, my hands shook so hard I had to sit on them. The men came back with the thing we went to get, and all their fingers. I called that a win. The chief called it proof. She hears the web, he told a new kid who still called me ma'am too loudly. She hears it hum. Word traveled the way it does on flights and in chow halls, over bad coffee in rooms where boots line up at the threshold. I wasn't a legend. I was a rumor that survived inspection. Teams rotated. I rotated with some of them. In Bahrain, the heat felt personal. In the Horn of Africa, the wind carried grit that found your seams and set up camp. I learned the sincerity of letters home written on the back of manifests, the way good men tell jokes before wheels up because laughter oils the machines that hunger for it. On leave, I went home once and found my father on the porch cleaning a rifle that didn't need it. He asked about the weather. He asked if I'd changed the oil in my car. He didn't ask what I did. I didn't tell him about the night we killed the lights in 3 blocks at once and walked the city like it had been returned to a better moon. I didn't tell him about the kid who slipped me a folded note at a checkpoint that said, in careful English, "Please take the loud men away." I didn't tell him I'd cried in a stairwell where the dust hid me and then walked back into the room because crying is an opposite to courage. It's kin. At Coronado again, between rotations, I rewrote checklists until they fit the way our days actually broke. Equipment that fails in rain, batteries that lie about their lifespan, how to count down a man whose eyes are looking somewhere he can't return from. Don't sell me a legend. I'm not selling you anything, I said. I'm standing where you can see me. The words were simple enough that they felt like furniture. The room made room for them. A man in a ball cap, a Vietnam vet I'd seen fold a flag with hands that didn't shake, rose halfway, then all the way. He didn't salute. He placed his hand over his heart. Something ancient moved along the tables, like wind through wheat. Another man stood. A woman who had worn the uniform in a different war stood. Remy straightened, as if coming to attention might hold the ceiling square. No one called Admiral on deck. That belonged to other days. But the effect rhymed, bodies remembering they knew how to rise when honor demanded knees to unlock. Dad's eyes flashed annoyance, then calculation. Then was it fear? Not of me, but of the revision. The past is a jealous scripture. It hates edits. He looked smaller inside his jacket. I let the silence sit where it needed to. I didn't list operations. I didn't rescue the night with anecdotes. I have never seen a story saved by being louder. Instead, I told one true thing, offered like a coin on a counter. Respect isn't inherited, I said. It's earned. Sometimes in rooms where no one can see. Sometimes right here. A chair scraped. The boy who had been measuring me with awe whispered to his dad, "She's really real." His father squeezed his shoulder. "Looks that way," he said. Mrs. Dwyer tried the microphone again. It squealed, and then minded. Why don't we take a minute, she said, the diplomat this town deserved. Coffee's hot. Cake's on the table. And if anyone wants to share a word for those serving, we can do that after. Movement broke the spell and blessed it. People migrated toward the coffee, not to drink it, but to recalibrate. Heads turned toward me, some with curiosity, some with apology, some with the gentle relief of puzzle solved. I added a line to every plan. Who's watching the watcher? The old guard grumbled until the metrics came clean. Fewer injuries, fewer near misses, more nights where the worst thing we brought home was sand. The nickname followed me like a shadow at noon, short and unmistakable. I never used it. Others did. Once, a visiting commander shook my hand and said, half smiling, "So, you're the spider?" I said, "I draw maps." He laughed and said, "And you make men feel safe inside them." It was the nicest thing anyone with stars on their collar ever said to me. There were losses, Some you can explain in reports, some you fold into a corner of yourself that no one else gets to touch. A good man went quiet one spring and didn't come back from it. I sat with his file until the letters blurred. After I insisted on monthly check-ins that weren't about push-ups, we started asking each other how the air felt inside, not just outside. A chief called it soft. Then, he stopped calling it anything after it saved a kid who hadn't yet learned how to say he was drowning. By the time the rumor had taken shape, my father had heard none of it. He lived 2 states away and 20 years behind. The town still loved him. The diner still knew his coffee order. If someone said my name, he changed the subject to the weather or taxes. In rooms far from him, men began to tell stories that started, "She was there," and ended, "And we walked out." I didn't need a parade. I needed my plans to hold. The night a young SEAL would one day recognize me across a crowded hall and lose his breath, he had been the new guy on a 2-vehicle package that should have gone bad and didn't. Afterward, he'd come up to the table where the radio slept and said, voice low, "Ma'am, did you see that coming?" I said, "I saw what could." He nodded like a man who just learned there are different kinds of sight. Men I had mowed lawns beside at 14 looked at me like I had grown a second spine and found it suited me. Remy came closer. We didn't hug. This wasn't that kind of room. He stood at a distance that said, "I know the rules," and lowered his voice. "I didn't mean to make it a scene," he said. "You didn't," I answered. "You made it honest." He nodded, his jaw locking and unlocking emotions, learning new boots. "He didn't know," he said, glancing at my father.
"He didn't want to," I said.
"There's a difference." Dad hovered near the stage hands, his hands clasped behind his back like a man inspecting a field he had sown for rocks. People gave him space, respect for what he had been, wrestling with irritation at what he was being. He stared at the flag and didn't salute. I poured coffee I didn't want and found myself surrounded by small talk that was really big talk. "We're proud of you, and did you know Artina joined the Air Force? And my brother served. He would have liked you." I accepted each sentence the way you accept medals. You'll never display them gently, because the giver needs the ceremony more than you do. When I turned back, Dad was closer, not close, but closer. He studied my face with a concentration that used to precede a lecture on discipline. "If any of this is true," he said, each word weighed. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked." I said then, "Kinder," because I couldn't. He considered that, and the fairness that had once made him a good junior officer reappeared around his eyes. "I didn't ask. I wanted." He stopped. "I expected." He stopped again. The sentence, a bridge with missing planks. Finally, I didn't know the language there. It was the first honest thing between us in years. Not absolution, but a foothold. "You don't have to speak it," I said. "You just have to stop correcting my accent." A laugh broke from someone behind us. Not unkind. Dad didn't smile, but his shoulders dropped 1/4 of an inch. That's what the teams taught me. That skill and humility can live in the same heart, that you can be invisible and indispensable at once. I learned the art of being where the plan lives, and the credit doesn't. Ghost work. Work that leaves a room cleaner than it found it. Work that lets other people become the story, so everyone goes home. They called me Black Widow. I called it doing my job. Some nights the quiet roared louder than rotors. Out there, silence meant cover, sound discipline. Radios hushed to a whisper. At home, it was punishment tailored to fit, the kind my father could wear for years without fraying. It filled the rooms we no longer shared and seeped under the door jambs of every conversation we didn't have. After my first deployment, I wrote him a letter on paper. I said the water was colder than it looks on posters, that good men learn to laugh before bad nights, that my work mattered even when no one pinned it to a board. I tucked in a photo. Me at the pier, one hand on a Pelican case, salt whitening the chain link fence. I signed it with love and a return address. The letter came back unopened. Mom kept the line alive by herself. Sunday evenings, she'd call and ask small questions that let a big life through. "Are you sleeping? Anything green on your plate? Did you find a chapel?" She never asked about operations. "I'm fine" was a dialect we both spoke. When we hung up, I stood and breathed. I mailed him a photo the day I picked up Lieutenant Bars. Fluorescent lights never make them look like they do in movies. Too pale, too honest. I wrote, "You taught me to stand straight. It helps." A month later, the same picture returned in a fresh envelope, creased once across the middle. No note. Illness entered quietly. "Biopsy," Mom said, like she was sounding it out for a spelling bee. My father informed me by email, 2 sentences correctly punctuated. I called from a stairwell in Bahrain where the heat clung like a wet shirt. And for the first time that night, he wasn't performing a man he needed to be. He was just a man, out of date and out of breath, trying to read a map that had acquired new roads while he slept. Remy lifted his cup toward me, a small salute, and then faded back into the cluster of men who knew how to be silent without being absent. Around us, the room reset to ordinary. The ice clinking in tea, the scrape of chairs, the clatter of forks. But nothing had returned to its old measurement. The scale had tilted, gently, permanently. Later, someone would say, "Do you remember the night Frank's line fell flat?" Someone else would say, "Do you remember the kid who trembled?" And a third would say, with the certainty of someone who saw the web after it was pointed out, "Do you remember how we all stood, just a little?" I do. I remember the exact sound the floor made when respect put its weight down. The town emptied into the night the way it always does, slowly, like a hymn thinning into echoes. After the hall, I drove the long way past the high school bleachers, the diner that never changed its pie, the hardware store that still displayed a flag in the window big enough to shade a truck. I let the engine idle by the river, where the water wore the moon like a bruise. I hadn't meant to stay, but leaving without checking my interior felt like bad planning. You don't step off a Target building without looking at your team. You don't close a door on a night like that without looking at yourself. My phone buzzed once, a text from an unknown number, then a second from a familiar one. Remy first. "Ma'am, didn't want to make a mess. Just wanted to hand back what you handed me." I typed back, "You did fine. We all got home. Mom told me not to come yet." "Dear job," she said. "I'll do mine." When hospice called, I was already wheels up. Hill caught my eye across the aisle and didn't ask. The nurse spoke softly. Mom's hands were translucent. Blue was suddenly a color to fear. My father stood at the window, arms crossed. He nodded when I entered and returned to watching the parking lot. I read to her because words were the first house we built together. Frost, then Mary Oliver, then whatever the visitor library offered. She drifted in and out like the tide. When she woke clear, she pressed 2 fingers to my sleeve and whispered, "Keep flying. Not away, just up." She died before sunrise. The room changed. At the funeral, I spoke second because he spoke first. I kept it simple. Her car that smelled like lemons in winter, the way she graded with a pencil and mercy, how she could name 5 birds by their silhouette. When I glanced down, my father was stapling the program together over and over, like the paper was the enemy. Then the second message, not words, but an image. A photo taken from the far end of the hall, slightly tilted, people standing, my father in the foreground, not standing, but not as straight as before, either, as if the air had changed density, and his body didn't quite know how to live in it yet. I slept at the base guest quarters that night, because history can crowd a house. In the morning, I ran the perimeter road until my ribs found their rhythm. Movement is a form of forgiveness you can give yourself without anyone's permission. When I finished, sweat stung my eyes and washed something else with it. By noon, I was sitting on the porch steps of my father's house, my palms flat on the paint that needed a new coat. He opened the door with his mouth already forming a sentence, and then stopped. He looked older on his own threshold than he had under the fluorescent lights. Men shrink differently under different skies. For a heartbeat, he seemed surprised that I had the address. Then he stepped back to let me in. "Coffee?" he asked, defaulting to ritual.